Holy City Center Radio. It is episode 205, and I am your host, Christian Sanger. Today is Wednesday, December 20th, 2023. The end of the year is rapidly approaching us. I mean, I knew that already, of course, but just seeing the date, the 20th of December, just a few days to go before Christmas. And then just shortly after that, bam, 2024 will be here. Unreal. What a year. It's been here in Holy City Cineland, crazy stuff. But this week, not so crazy. Been pretty quiet around here. Not a whole lot going on. Just working hard and, preparing for the holidays and traveling back to Connecticut to see my family. Very much looking forward to that. But nothing really interesting to share with you guys. So let's just get into the news, which is going to be interesting, of course. As you all are well aware at this point, we had quite the storm over the weekend, starting late on Saturday night, going basically all day into Sunday. Yes, I know the rain kind of tapered off as the day went on, but it was still sprinkling there for a while. And although we knew bad weather was heading our way, it seemed a lot of people were kind of underprepared, or their expectations were a little bit different than what we ended up getting. That is for sure. So according to local media, including who I'm sure got a lot of their information from National Weather Service and places like that, the city of Charleston on Sunday recorded its highest non-tropical tide on record. So this being a nor'easter, of course, being December, this is a non-tropical tide, and this is the biggest one ever. Now, of course, as far as we know, as long as records have been kept, which is a pretty significant amount of time. So it still is saying something, even though we don't have a full history, of course. But the highest non-tropical tide on record ever. Obviously, this is due to the heavy rains that the nor'easter brought. But in addition to that, we also had, of course, as we do every day, a high tide at some point in time. So combining those led to pretty significant flooding, especially downtown, but in many places in the area, as well as the state for that matter. And of course, it led to numerous closures of roads. Some schools moved to e-learning. Some events and businesses either closed, canceled, postponed events. It was a little bit heavier than we were expecting, for sure. Speaking of the rest of the state, up the coast, authorities reported to an observed tornado in addition to everything else that we were dealing with here in the state. It hit parts of Forest Brook and Sacasti in Horry County around 1:25 p.m. Floodwaters forced temporary road closures from the Low Country all the way to the Grand Strand. So this was pretty significant. Other states, of course, were affected as well, but we got hit pretty heavy. Back here to the peninsula, the medical district and other parts of that area saw, floodwaters that could be as high as knee deep in some places. Obviously, no surprise, plenty of roads were closed. We had lots of cars that were trapped. That part's not new. We know when there's a significant storm, we're going to get flooding and things. But again, this is one of the most significant ones we've ever gotten. Specifically, the most significant one that was a non-tropical related event. Specifically, the Charleston tide peaked at 9.86 feet, and that became the city's fourth highest tide of all time. So biggest non-tropical, but fourth highest all time. So again, putting that in perspective, oh yeah, the highest non-tropical tide, that's still significant, of course, but it must be way down there. No, fourth highest of all time. So that's pretty crazy to think about as well. In addition, it's one of the largest we've had behind Hurricane Hugo's 12.52 feet in 1989. There was also an unnamed storm in 1940 that brought tides of 10.23 feet, and then Hurricane Irma's 9.92 foot levels back in 2017 are the worst flooding levels we've seen, and then this one was the fourth. So pretty significant, not only this storm, but also knowing that of the top four, two of them happened within the last just handful of years. An average of 4 inches of rain hit the city of Charleston. It closed about 40 roads, is what the Post and Courier was reporting. As I mentioned before, the rainfall kind of tapered off by the afternoon, and there really wasn't any significant flooding after that. Obviously, there were still plenty of places that were still draining and roads that were closed, but everything went as expected once nightfall came. And you can go check the link in the show notes, but you can also see other stories. There's a ton out there. There are businesses that have spoken to local media. They've the floodwaters obviously affected them. Some of them had water going into their businesses, and again, because of the significance of this and how big it was, a lot of businesses weren't even prepared. They were ready for, oh well, normally when we have a bad storm, this floods, this happens, but there were some new issues because of how high it was, and they just were expecting, for instance, if you've owned a home or a business where it frequently floods, you tend to know where the problem areas are. And because of, kind of unexpected how big this was, some new issues cropped up. So you see some stories about that. There was unfortunately sewage running through the streets in some areas into businesses. The most tragic thing that happened was there was a death in Mount Pleasant. A 70-year-old plus, I forget the exact age, but she was in her 70s, I believe 72, was trapped in a car when the floodwaters, like a flash flood came, and unfortunately they could not get out, and they ultimately passed despite authorities trying to get to her and attempting life-saving measures once they got to her in her car. So I think I saw, as of this recording, there was 3 total deaths related to the storm period in the country, and one of those, of course, was here in Mount Pleasant. So certainly tragic situation there. Thankfully it wasn't any worse than that as far as injuries and deaths. Meanwhile, another sign of how significant this storm was, Patriots Point Naval and Maritime Museum, of course, home to the USS Yorktown, amongst other exhibits and ships and things. They announced a temporary closure and didn't reopen until Tuesday. So they actually closed on Monday. They expected to be open on Monday originally, but because the storm actually shifted the USS Yorktown enough that they wanted to make sure everything was okay and get it back into place. So this is only the second time that the Yorktown has actually shifted from where it is here, on the Mount Pleasant side of the harbor. The only other time was back when Hurricane Hugo hit in 1989, and for reference, the ship has been over there since 1975. So since 1975, through all the storms, hurricanes, whatever else, Hurricane Hugo moved it a little bit, and this storm. Now, granted, the amount it moved during Hugo was much more than this storm did, but still, only the second storm to actually move it. So I learned this. I actually had no idea exactly what the setup was, but the Yorktown is actually buried in more than 25 feet, buried deep into like the pluff mud, the base level, 25 feet into that mud. And so the ship doesn't actually like rise or fall with the tides, whereas the USS Laffey, a destroyer, it does do that, because it's held up through mooring lines and it moves freely with the tides. So the Yorktown is basically just sturdy in the mud, 25 feet deep. So it does not really move. During Hugo, it lifted an estimated 6 feet before finally resettling. But during Sunday's nor'easter, the ship moved approximately 6 inches. So again, not huge in the grand scheme of things, especially when you consider it was 6 feet versus 6 inches when we look back at Hurricane Hugo. But still, that is very significant in the fact that it's only the second time the ship has moved during a storm. So, obviously, there's other stories out there. I encourage you to look for it, just showing how it seems many people were unprepared for this storm for whatever reason. And it just shows what our normal is going to be when we have these storms, whether they're tropical or non-tropical. You can always expect flooding even on sunny days, low tide. It happens sometimes. But this just shows how significant waters can rise and how deep they can get into the peninsula and the businesses and homes and everything else that's affected by it. And although there's efforts in place, we just get used to this, because it's not going anywhere and there's just no way to reverse it. Charleston's mayor-elect William Cogswell announced some key members of his executive team. There are 5 people that were highlighted as part of this executive team. There may be more folks that are hired. The campaign also said that there was no plans to change other positions within the city government. Some he may let go and bring on some other folks. But at this time, these are the only real announcements they've made as it relates to staffing. I'll run down the list of the 5 folks, and there's a couple I want to point out that I think are significant. So the chief of staff will be Elizabeth Applegate Deek. Logan McVeigh will serve as Chief Policy Officer. Deja Knight McMillan is the Director of Communications. Wendell Gilliard will be Special Advisor as it relates to quality of life and community outreach. And Mika Gadsden will serve as a Special Advisor for community and environmental initiatives. So those last 2 are the ones I think are significant. I know Deja, I've talked to her many times over the years. I don't know the other 2, to be honest with you, so I don't have a ton. I know the background, their education and stuff was provided, but I think those last 2, State Representative Wendell Gilliard and Mika Gadsden, of course, who ran for mayor, I think this is another example showing that Cogswell, at least here in these early days, is showing uh, that he is not this extremist, MAGA Republican that some have painted him as or worried he might be because of, a donation that someone from Moms for Liberty made to him. And the fact that he served as a Republican in South Carolina's, state house. So a lot of people were worried. And then on the opposite hand, you had a lot of people cheering, thinking he was going to implement more like Trumpian type policies and fight those kind of culture wars and things. But by adding Gilliard and Gadsden, both of which are more on the left side of the spectrum, although Gadsden, I would say, is more liberal than Gilliard in many ways. So overall, I think it shows that he is willing to work with people who ideology wise might not line up with him all the time, but he didn't stack his executive team with, people that are going to be, yes men or yes women telling him whatever he wants to hear. He's got at least a couple voices that will, show a different perspective. So again, I think this is a good move. We'll see what happens. Of course, sometimes you have these good teams, but maybe it doesn't actually get implemented correctly. But so far, so good. Again, I think it's showing that he's at least willing to work with everybody and not just rely on old political mores or norms, I should say. Only work with your team. Maybe pay some lip service to the other side. But because this is not supposed to be the mayoral race is not supposed to be something that has any political affiliation with it. It's, that when they run, we knew obviously what side of the political spectrum the candidates were on for the most part, but you don't actually declare a party. And I think this is showing that he, again, is going to be a mayor for everyone. And we'll see what happens. But it's a nice surprise to see, the types of things he's said so far and the people that he's willing to work with. I think it's a good sign that he's going to be much more moderate than a lot of people thought he was going to be. And again, whether it was you were afraid or were ecstatic, I think he's going to be more central than a lot of people assumed. The last story is from the Post and Courier, using some data from the Charleston County's Criminal Justice Coordinating Council. I think it's an important story. And although some people from the headlines might make some assumptions, again, in many different ways, I think it's interesting to look at and really dive into the data and some of the quotes that are in this article. So obviously, I'm going to give you an overview as always, but I encourage you to read the whole article. The article headline is Young Black Men Disproportionately Arrested in Charleston County for Gun Carrying. And then they add at the end of that, why? Question mark. Well, I think a lot of people immediately are, racism. And yeah, I mean, of course, this isn't a new narrative. This isn't whether it's a narrative in the sense of anecdotal or actual evidence with percentages and, per capita arrests and things like that. We've heard this before. None of this is surprising. But I still think there's some important data in there, again, regardless of what you think about this. So in a county where less than 25% of the population is Black, and obviously in a country that is just awash in guns, young Black men are disproportionately arrested for carrying a firearm. Now, this is coming from a study by Charleston County Criminal Justice Coordinating Council. They put out this report on December 11th. The study looked at a bunch of different things. One of the other parts of that study was that people in this county, more people are locked up in the county jail for unlawful carrying of a firearm than any other charge, regardless of race, gender, or anything else. If you look at everyone who's been arrested and put in county jail, the most frequent charge is the unlawful carrying of a firearm, which raises a bunch of questions as well. Why are there so many illegal guns when this is one of the most permissive states when it comes to being able to not only own but carry a gun? So why are there so many illegal ones? There's all sorts of different directions that this study can go in, and that's just one of them. Now, of those people, the vast majority are men, 90%. And the vast majority are black, 91%. So that's when you look at a population of this county is 25%. But of all those unlawful carrying of a firearm arrests, 90% are men and 91% are black. Now, why is that? Again, many different reasons. And also of interest, I think, is nearly half of those people are under the age of 25. Now, the analysis looked at jail bookings focused on the first 10 months of 2023, during which more than 700 people were booked for illegal gun carrying. The offense is poised to be the most booked charge at the jail for the third consecutive year, according to the CJCC, which releases these annual reports of jail use. So, unless there's some dramatic change over the end of this month, that will be the third straight year that is the most booked charge at the jail. The findings show that the front end of Charleston County's criminal justice system shows disproportionate resources arresting young black men on the misdemeanor firearm offense. Critics of law enforcement, of course, say that the data shows over policing of black people, while law enforcement officials and supporters say they are present in those communities because residents report feeling unsafe due to crime. So it's that classic argument of, well, we're picking up more people in those communities because we are told by people in those communities that they need more policing, so we're there more often. Now, the CJCC partners with law enforcement, court officials, and community groups to implement reforms that they say are data driven and they hope will improve public safety and community well being. The group, if you're wondering, is founded by the county and the MacArthur Foundation, which finances efforts nationwide to reduce mass incarceration. Now, this demographic arrested on illegal firearms charges is the same demographic for people most at risk for gun violence. A culture that, the Post and Courier is reporting is steeped in guns in some places, and that there's easy access to firearms for anybody. It doesn't matter, again, really. And the threat of interpersonal violence leads many young black men living in communities with high crime rates to arm themselves. Now, this is from the Post and Courier article, and they are putting that data and that assertion on people who work in gun violence prevention. So they didn't provide any data or anything like that, but they did speak to people in gun violence prevention, and that is what they say leads to young black men, one of the reasons why they may be illegally carrying guns in the first place. Now, of course, that doesn't change the fact that there may be over policing, racism involved, et cetera, et cetera. South Carolina, you've probably heard of like stop and frisk. That was a thing in New York, which was basically just anybody could be stopped for any reason. And it would a lot of times just be nonsense, and they'd pat someone down and then find, a gun or drugs or something on them. But they really had no precursor for them to be stopped to begin with. That stuff likely happens here as well. And who knows, it's hard to keep track of things like that, of course. So there's a lot of reasons that we from point A to point B. But again, I think there's a lot of information in this article that everyone should take a look at. Now, looking at another end of this problem, patients with gunshot wounds seen at the Medical University of South Carolina's Violence Intervention Program are roughly the same demographic that's booked into jail on the firearm charge. This is according to Krista Green, who is the program director of MUSC's Turning the Tide Violence Intervention Program. That program provides care and some other services to victims and their families that are impacted by gun violence, with the goal to prevent repeat violence and improve health, social, and economic outcomes. Patients in the program have told trauma surgeon Ashley Hink that they themselves carry a gun for protection. So there's a lot of different angles here. I hope I point out a few different ones. Like, yes, the easy answer when you see this is racism, whether that's institutional or on the very base level of the cop, the police officer themselves. that's out there. But there are other sides to this. There are other ways to lessen these arrests, of course, and it's not 100% on that. There is more to it, although again, that's not just the easy and most clear answer, which is the whole Occam's razor. Like the most simple solution or the most obviously answer is usually the one. But there's more tentacles of this problem, which we know in this country. Gun violence affects everyone, regardless of race. And we have many, many problems across the spectrum as it relates to guns in this country. But this is just a small sampling of the country here in Charleston County specifically. And I think the data shows what we might have expected because of what we've already known about arrests in this country and policing. But there are other, I think, other ways to look at it as well. So not to say don't pay attention to that because that's still a huge problem, but also looking at why is that part of certain communities' culture? And by communities, I don't mean just a particular race, but a particular literal community. A neighborhood or a section of neighborhoods. What is it about those neighborhoods that people feel they need to be carrying guns? Specifically, why are they also carrying illegal guns? So there's other things to look at is my point, even though we know the obvious answer and have to work on that. And some cities and states are doing better than others when it comes to that. But there are sometimes some of these other things down the line get lost in the conversation. And I think this piece did a pretty good job of laying out some of those and talking to people involved on different sides of the gun violence problem. So I encourage you to visit the show and the link in the show notes to get some more info. That'll do it for this edition of Holy City Center Radio. Thank you so much for listening. I appreciate it. Please like, subscribe, rate, and review, whatever else you can do on whatever platform you're listening on. I appreciate it. A big thanks to Lindsay Marie Collins with LMC Sound System for producing this and every episode of Holy City Center Radio. And thank you to Tyler Boone, whose music you hear in each and every show. I will talk to you all again on Friday as we get closer and closer to the Christmas holiday. Stay safe out there, stay warm, have fun. Hope the rest of your week isn't too bad. I'll talk to you on Friday, but until then, good night and good luck.